Welcome to the Game Dev Local Podcast. I'm your host, Nina Kim, and today, Jeff Sparks will be joining us as our wonderful guest. Jeff is a design director and founding member of Mythright, an indie game publishing company he started with a small team of his coworkers from Epic Games Publishing and Mediatonic. He has worked internationally and has many years of experience in the industry, working across a variety of genres, studio structures, and teams. Thank you so much for joining us, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is awesome.
I just wanted to start off with a favorite question of mine just to get people to know you a little bit. How did you end up in the game industry, and what was your journey like as a designer?
Wow, yeah. I mean, that's a big one. I suppose on the how did I end up in the game industry, it was sort of always this huge passion of mine. Growing up with video games and just being totally enamored and immersed in them for a lot of my childhood. It was really like that was the main thing I wanted to do, but it wasn't really like a real job to me. Like it didn't really compute to me that that was something you could do as a job for a living or even like have any real understanding of how they were made. So for a long time as a kid, I would just tell people I wanted to be a computer programmer because I thought that's how you made video games. So that was my kind of go-to line. And then as I grew up and went through high school and college, it was sort of like I tried on a bunch of different creative roles and tried writing and playing music and doing a bunch of other things before finally kind of circling around to okay, this is a real thing. This is like I saw that they were a lot of schools were opening like game art programs and game design programs, and I was like, oh, this is like a course of study you could take to like go and work in the industry. And so after a while, and I think what really made it real is when I was in one of these programs, we like went and visited an actual game studio and seeing people with like all their little like toys on their desks and like R2D2s and things. Like I was like, oh, this is something I can do. I can totally do this. And the more time I spent in the program working with people, talking to artists and programmers and designers and that sort of thing, um, it was like became clear that like um, collaborating with people on these things is like something I'm good at and that I can sort of like work effectively and like move these things forward and kind of organize people. And I think that's kind of I guess for a long time I assumed I would be either an artist or a programmer. I didn't know what a designer did. Um, but being in a program that was largely kind of art focused, there were a lot of artists and a lot of people who were really good at ZBrush and hard surface modeling and kind of modular environment kit building and that sort of thing. And I wasn't quite as good at that. But when it did come time to make something with those things, I was like, oh, this I can do. Like I can kind of guide these artists and do some problem solving and kind of like start putting the pieces together. And so that in terms of the second question, how did I find my way into design? That was kind of it. I sort of fell into it and have been there ever since, really. Like kind of teetering around. I do a little bit of art from time to time, a little bit of writing. I'm trying to learn coding and that sort of thing, but really like it's all in service of game design, I think.
Yeah, I always like to ask that question to designers because I feel like a lot of us take a weird path into design. Do you ever feel like um, the previous jobs you had or the hobbies you have feed into who you are as a designer? Because I know like even the weirdest experiences I have or the jobs that it feels kind of meaningless. Like I was a barista, but I still feel like a lot of my experience as barista like feeds into some of my designs of like how players interact with certain experiences. And so I was wondering if you feel that way.
Yeah, all the time. I would say even like a lot of life experience feeds into that as well. Trying to see, you know, how people behave and respond to things outside of video games as well. But certainly within video games, I think the one that early on in my career made the most sense to me was I did a little bit of um, like set design and art direction for like high school theater productions and like building out those little worlds and like those little presentations that the actors could like play in, and building like throne, like a throne for the king. We did like Narnia, so you had to make like the throne room and all this stuff, and like having that experience where you are building these little worlds and trying to like immerse people in them to the best of your ability with like some paint and some glue and some wood. You like just have these very rudimentary little tools. Early on, that made the most sense to me. I was like, oh, this is like we're creating these little immersive worlds digitally, to the best of our ability, and kind of like putting up those, I don't know, those little imaginary places and putting them together.
Yeah. So throughout your career, you've experienced a wide variety of types of development, from mobile free to play to uh, like indie and triple A. Also, you've experienced your growth through like being an intern to being a designer to being a lead to being a director. So I was really interested in what are the differences that you've noticed in the development flow and process between all of those, and with the caveat that of course it differs depending on studio specifics as well, but do you see any commonalities?
Yeah, I mean that's a really broad question in terms of like, because every team is different, and all of the projects I've been on have been so totally different. There are some through lines, I suppose, where it's like the priority of the work and the scope and size of the team and all of those sorts of things. So it is interesting to kind of bucket things into, mobile or live ops development, which is quite fast paced and data driven, and where in contrast to something like indie game development, which is very like scrappy and much smaller teams that are generally kind of more tightly knit and pointed at a really kind of clear creative vision, and more in the vein of like exploring and kind of pushing boundaries and making like those dream games, rather than standing too much on example. And then AAA stuff tends to be, I've been fortunate that this hasn't been the case in some instances, but AAA tends to be very risk averse and long winded, and a lot of moving parts. And you can end up with really siloed off teams that aren't really sure, like they just know their one thing that they do. Like the Forza Motorsport series is a big one, where it was like you had like the car team that like was responsible for kind of like bringing these real world machines into the game, and that was like all they did. And we outsourced a lot of it too, and it was sort of like their whole, they didn't know what was going on with the rest of development for the most part. They were just like, they were the cog in this big machine. And so it is interesting to me to talk to people who've done different things and who've worked in different capacities. I feel very fortunate to have kind of like been a part of all these different types of projects. And for a long time, it felt like I would just work on whatever I could get, like whatever people would allow me to work on. So I feel fortunate that I just kind of fell into this very diverse kind of like experience over the years, because I could talk to most people, most designers, about like what they're up to, and sort of have common ground or be able to relate to like the ups and downs of it all.
Yeah, I imagine that kind of feeds into what you do in your current role. So right now you're a design director for a publisher, Mythright. But it seems a bit unusual to have like a designated design section in a publisher, from what I've seen, anyways. So, what is your role like? What are your responsibilities?
Yeah, it's like explaining to people outside the industry what a game designer does, and then you kind of multiply that by what does a designer at a publisher do, and you're in another world of like, I don't know, obfuscation, where you have to kind of like really walk through things. Um, but I guess it is maybe becoming less unusual to have a design team, or so, at least someone who's design minded at publishers, especially larger ones. But in the indie game space, I suppose, which is where I've done most of my publishing, we're just sort of a support class, really. As developers are working through things, a lot of times, especially in indie games, it's like their first game, or um, they're a solo developer, and those types of things. Those can be really challenging, um, sort of like compositions to work on a game in, when you don't have anyone to talk to or anyone to bounce ideas off of, or anyone to kind of like give you feedback that you can kind of like trust, and believe in. So that's sort of the gig, for me, and how it's been. I worked on the publishing side at Turn 10 on the Forza team, but then, more recently, the transition from the irregular corporation Mediatonic days to Epic, and then now with Mythright, the way I've always approached the design side is, trying to understand what people are up to, and to kind of like believe in it and support it and help it become a reality, as to the best of my ability. Sometimes it's a little more light touch, where I just check in and play a build and talk about it. And sometimes it's a little more involved, where it's like, let's, it's a little closer to like a co-development kind of situation, where we're, in the build, or helping balance the economy, or doing mock-ups to support some new feature or something. So it really varies, and I think that's what I enjoy most about it. I found on the development side, you kind of spend all of your time on one set of problems on one game, like for years and years. On the publishing side, you sort of parachute in and say, okay, what are we working on? And you try your best to kind of add value to that, and then you're on to the next thing. And by the time you circle back around and talk to that developer again, they're kind of like, they've just gotten so far, like there's like rocket fuel. They just kind of like go off and solve things and build things, and you check in again. And it's always really encouraging and really inspiring in a lot of ways, to kind of like be around people who are that passionate about things. It's just like that indie developer, like, we can do it kind of spirit is really contagious. And so there's a lot of things I picked up over the years, but it's just a really cool gig.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I imagine that your versatility and your experience across like all these different types of development helps with um, kind of helping these teams, and being able to adapt to what they need or what they want. Um, I was wondering, when it comes to this type of role, it does seem very different in some ways. I mean, you mentioned like, what is a game designer? That it's sort of like, answering that question. But I think it's a bit different too, because, like, I think there's a somewhat different mode of communication that's required for your type of job, where, um, like, you're kind of a little bit separated from the development team in this sense. And so your mode of communication seems to be like, may need to be a little different. Have you found that, or is it quite similar?
Um, it is different in that, with kind of internal development, when you're like working on a team more directly, I suppose. Use there's design, especially, is kind of expected to be the answer, like the answer source, where it's like, what are we doing? How does this work? What are we like? What's next? What's the priority? And um, so that can be like you sort of become the authority on, like the torchbearer, I think, for the project. Whereas when you're on the publishing side, you're kind of working with the torchbearers of their own project. A lot of times it's the same person who's doing everything, but you do sort of, there's a lot more sort of diplomacy, I suppose, where you're um, really trying to not so much impose your will, but sort of like share your experience and sort of like point out pitfalls maybe that you've run into before, or highlight opportunities that um, maybe the developer might have missed, or a lot of it is also sort of just like your more typical kind of like publisher feedback and guidance, where it's like things like genre fit and feature set and price points, and kind of how to best get to a play test and respond to feedback and like deal with um, conversations with your community and that sort of thing. So it is it's sort of a different ballgame where you look at it a bit more holistically, and really try to. I think the big challenge is like nobody really like, maybe that's an overstatement, but nobody really like signs with a publisher to have another cook in the kitchen, to have someone who's going to like try and tell them what to do, or try and um, you know impose their will, basically. So it does take a bit of like, hey, I'm on your team, like I believe in this. Like it's so easy for me in a lot of ways to believe in what people are working on, because I love so many different types of games that I get excited about what people are working on, like a broad diversity of things. And I think that comes from maybe working on games I wasn't so like working in genres I wasn't so keen on early in my career, like casino games and like hunting games and racing games and that kind of stuff. Like weren't really my cup of tea, but like the working on them and the process of building them and thinking about the players was like exciting enough and engaging enough that like it's it was a little bit easier. So now when people are working on things I'm excited about, it's a little easier for me to kind of like see the dream and get excited about it and try to ensure that it has the best chance possible of really finding its audience, and to, maybe even to a greater extent, to be a creatively fulfilling process for the developer.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I kind of feel like a part of design is finding the joy in things that like you may not typically find the joy in. Like I actually find it to be like really fulfilling challenge. Like like I'm not a big sports person, but when I look at sports games, I'm like, oh, that's actually a really good mechanic. I'm really pleased with it. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I was playing Supermarket Simulator right before this call, and like it's so silly, and like I don't know, that it is like a truly fun thing to like run your own little supermarket in this video game, and it's kind of crazy that they managed to find the fun in that and to spin those mechanics in such a like simple and straightforward and kind of satisfying way. It's really really compelling.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people bring up like the example of Power Wash Simulator, and it's like,
Yeah, for sure.
but actually, like, if I really think about it, I'm like, I could find that really satisfying in real life. So it's like maybe it's like using the opportunity to like take something that you find really exciting and but other people find mundane, and then like getting them to see the light. like like I like organizing coins. It's like that's so boring, but I really like it. There's got to be like some way to spin it, right?
Absolutely. I think you can probably gamify a lot of things and find the joy in it and find the thing that people really enjoy about
Yeah,
it.
like there's that game where you're like cooking eggs for people.
Oh yeah, Arctic eggs. Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't make me. Yeah, I'll go off on that one. I played that one over the holiday break, and it was so fun and so out there. Kind of in the same way that Supermarket Sim is out there, honestly. Like there's this sort of lightning in a bottle kind of feeling with a lot of these things that are so strange to me, and that someone kind of like took an idea like that and ran with it. And I'm just so happy to see these indies find success with their crazy ideas.
Yeah. Speaking of indies and uh, creative ideas, so people constantly come up with different crazy ideas, and they're like, wouldn't this make a good game, and that sort of thing. But like, there's a lot that goes into making something successful. Um, or even creating like a successful pitch that lands with people. So you've seen and created a lot of pitches yourself. What are some qualities of the better pitches that you've seen?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I've done a lot of pitching myself too over the years. So it's definitely not there's no real magic bullet um, for those types of things. I would say the ones that stick with me and the ones that immediately came to mind as you were asking the question were ones where the developer seems to care about the deck and the presentation of things as much as they care about their build. I've seen a lot of things where the build was really amazing and the deck is kind of like thrown together without a lot of thought. And it always makes me question priorities, I suppose, or like how much they actually believe in it. Because that's the sort of thing you really want in a lot of ways is uncynical kind of like belief in a thing, especially in the indie space where it's like that passion for the project is going to really dictate whether or not things go well for the project in a lot of ways, because you've just got to show up every day and work on the thing. You got to like sit down at your desk and be excited about it, or at least motivated enough to like kind of put your shoulder against the grindstone every day. So if you're doing it for kind of like cash grabby reasons or sort of like I don't know, you're not inspired by the thing, it's that much harder. So that's one of the things you really try to detect early on is like like is this a cool idea, and B, like, do we think the team can actually do this? And then see like what's their level of kind of like excitement and enthusiasm for this thing. So um yeah, I've seen some really bad ones. I've seen some really good ones. It's definitely not one of those things that like makes or breaks like a pitch, I suppose. Like the deck can be pretty ropey if the build is like amazing and that sort of thing. But it does sort of like when you sort of the total package where you like talk to the people, you look at the deck, you play the build, and then you kind of squint and you go, okay, is this a thing? Like, does this feel like a goer?
I
So
I
yeah.
think I can understand that in a way too, because if there's clarity in the deck, if there's clarity in the pitch, like you can see the passion, they know what they're doing, they have a game plan, like they should be able to like put that in, and if they do put that in a pitch, then like there's less friction, right? They already have it, they already know where they're going, they know how to show their passion, they believe in it, and I've found that when making design documents for projects. Like sometimes just writing out the design and like what the game plan is and what are the benefits and like why this is what we should be doing really clarifies the the project itself and then really gives it legs. So I think I understand, like I think having a good pitch deck really is reflective of that in a way.
Yeah, and it's one of those things. It's nice to be proud of the thing you're kind of shopping around to. You don't want to like open the deck or and be like, there's like kind of like this. Like you want to be excited about it. In some spaces more than others, but like the tone and the mood and like the concept art and like especially if you're so this is another thing, right? If your prototype is kind of cobbled together with off the shelf assets and placeholder stuff and cubes and gray boxes and that sort of thing, like your deck is going to have to do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of like what does this ultimately look like in your mind? What can your team actually pull off? And that's where as much art and kind of like scene setting and sort of like demonstration of those things is really important. If your interface looks like, you know, right, like off the shelf, or debug or default kind of like Unreal or Unity stuff, it's sort of like, well, then what do you ultimately see is that if it's a good opportunity to kind of like color in between the lines a little bit and kind of showcase like this is where we're headed, and we can kind of call our shots. So
Yeah, it seems like there's different ways of going about that too. If you're like not an artist, you can have like the references to what that art may look like in the end, or even like shaders. You could put shaders on like kind of store-bought assets to create a cohesive look. Like it's about the polish that or the put the effort that you put in to show that you actually care about what you're making.
yeah, that's it.
It's funny because I was trying to think of like a real life scenario that I could compare it to, and I was like, it's like when you dress yourself up, you show that you care about yourself. I'm
Yeah,
really bad at that, so that's my example. But yeah, I think people have told me they're like, if you want like people to like know that you respect yourself, you should take care of yourself. If maybe it's like that for games, you should take care of your game that you're pitching.
that's right. Yeah, it's like so much of it is just doing the work, I suppose, to show that you're invested and like that you believe in it. Like so much of like being a successful game developer of any stripe, I suppose, is like soft skills, being able to give and receive feedback in a respectful way, being on time for meetings, like all of these sorts of things. It's like there, yeah, there's so many ways to let it fall apart if you just don't care. And yeah, I think that, so to circle back around to pitch decks, it's like you should kind of feel like the developer cared enough to like put a deck together. And a lot of, I guess, the counter argument to that a lot of the time will be like, well, we were busy making the game, like the deck isn't important to us or whatever. Um, and I guess it's just one of those things where it's like, if your build speaks for itself, then that's great. But if it's super early or non-existent, we see a lot of, I've seen a lot of pitches that are just the deck, where it's just like, this is the concept, and those are the most kind of like interesting, but also a lot of times they're like the most ropey, I suppose, where they're like something like this, where it's just like this super undefined kind of blue sky version of this game that's a little too nebulous to stand on.
Yeah. So it sounds like just having a good balance, trying to strike a good balance with that is the sweet spot. Um, so, are there any patterns that you've seen teams have that contributed to their success? And that's with like indies or non indies, just across all teams.
Oh, yeah. Well, there are definitely things that you look for. Like, it's so hard to like generalize in terms of like things that work well, but I would say that producers are the unsung heroes of game development. And if you have a good producer on your team, your odds of success go up times a million. Like having seen developers flounder and struggle to kind of like get their act together and waste energy and time and passion in because they're just pointed in the wrong direction, or things aren't properly time boxed, or communication across the studio is in shambles. Like honestly, throughout my career, the best experiences I have are almost entirely attributed to having a strong production arm or a strong production presence in the studio or on the project. That continues to this day. Like in my current situation across all projects, like I work with some of the best producers in the industry. And I think earlier in my career, I just took it for granted. It was like, oh, they're producers. Yeah, they make everything go. And that's another thing. Like asking a designer what they do in the industry is one thing. Ask a producer, and it's like we make the whole thing go. It's just like it's hard to like overstate um, just how crucial they are. Everyone's important, obviously. There's no game without coders. It'll never make it out the door without QA. You need strong direction and designers, and you need artists and storytellers and all of this as well. But man, like one of the major kind of canary in the coal mine risks that I see on projects is they're like, yeah, we're just kind of making stuff. Like, yeah, we don't need a producer. Like, you're just it just immediately sort of like alarm bells going off. So
I think they're also really taken for granted. Same thing with QA, but I feel like producers
absolutely.
are really taken for granted. There's a lot of studios that I've seen that they're like, we don't have a producer. I don't know why we need a producer. I'm like, I know why you need a producer.
Yeah.
But I like you, I was really lucky early in my career where like Big Fish had really great producers and we had a lot of them, and it was just everything ran smoothly and it was so nice. And then I had experiences where I didn't have a producer and I was like, oh, that's what happens when you don't have a producer. It's
Yeah.
funny, like when they're
Yeah.
gone, you really miss them. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny too. One of the things, like, it's a funny thing for designers like us to sit here and say, like, oh, producers are the best, because there's this kind of industry wide fable of like the designers versus the producers. And I've definitely been on projects where that's been framed as like the internal struggle of the studio, where it's like design wants the game to be an 11 out of 10, and we want to spend a million years on it and we'll never be satisfied with the result. And producers are like, it doesn't matter, get it in the box, get it out the door. And that there's this like conflict that's happening. And I feel like that's that either shouldn't be or isn't truly the case, and that's just sort of like this story we tell ourselves to I don't know, to generate misery. Like really, like as a designer, understanding how much time you have, time boxes, right? We say it all the time, like understanding what your time box is. Do we have 2 weeks on this? Do we have 3 months on this? Obviously we want it to be done to the best degree possible in the shortest amount of time possible, but it's hard to scope, and it's hard to know how far you can push things if you don't know how long you have to work on it. And you can always ask for more time, and it almost always in the game industry you end up needing more time because games are complicated, they take forever to come together, and nothing ever really seems to go as planned. But yeah, I find working with producers and working with good producers especially, it's not like that. It's a game of let's figure this out together, let's problem solve, and let's really like have a meaningful collaboration so people aren't wasting their time and aren't pointed at the wrong objectives and all of that stuff.
Do you think that's because you're uh more closer to a production
Yeah, no,
baseline? Yeah.
that's definitely a thing. Being on the publishing side, you definitely, I don't know, just almost by like osmosis, you get sort of production mind, where it's like, okay, we do this development, we do these things, we build these features, and then these features, and then content, and then writing, and then play testing and bug fixing and all of that stuff. Um, but I do think it makes you a better designer to know, like, it's just another like time and energy are just another thing to consider when you're building out the scope for your game and kind of trying to offer direction to creative people.
Yeah, because I've definitely run into designers that butt heads with the the producers and see them as sort of like a blockage to their creativity and the quality of a game. And it seems it seems like a hard conversation for them, but I think coming up from mobile free to play, I've been trained to really scope in small bits and like really make use of a little what little I have. But then I found that designers that kind of push past that and they don't consider production balance me out. So it's kind of nice as well, but it is interesting. I think, yeah, maybe it's nice to have both.
Yeah. And I think coming from live operations, like you said, be it mobile or console or anything like that, where it's like you're on the content treadmill or the feature treadmill, where it's like we got to get a new thing out every 3 weeks or every 6 weeks or whatever it is. Really like, because I came from mobile early in my career as well, and you sort of like get used to that whole, you get to go through the whole development cycle just kind of in a microcosm because you're adding to an existing thing, and kind of building a template for like, okay, this is how we're going to put new content into the game, new levels or characters or whatever it is. So that turning of the machine and being like, okay, that's how we do it, that's how long it takes, this is the process, plan it, build it, play test it, bug fix it, and it's out. And it's sort of like doing that so much early in your career, you do kind of like get a sense of how long things are going to take and how you're impacting these other departments with your scope and with your ideas. That was another thing someone kind of like took me aside, because I was a very eager designer back when I started working on mobile games, and I was like, I'm going to stay late and I'm going to be in the studio early and I'm going to build all this crazy stuff and it's going to be done to this really high degree of polish, or it's going to be where I want it to be. It's going to be to the level of finish that I want, even if it takes us right up against the red line to releasing things. And I had a design mentor of mine kind of take me aside and be like, it's not just you showing up early and kind of working all the way to the deadline is like bad for everyone. Like you're making more work for a lot of people. It's good to have that sort of like quality bar and to sort of like work towards that, but you don't have to break yourself. Like your quality bar and what's actually needed and what players are actually going to notice in the game, there might be more delta between those things than you think. So it's sort of like being a considerate team member, where it's not like I'm going to work on this until it's like past pencils down time, so that we're like having to QA a thing within 24 hours of it going live to players. It's like you're not like acting like you're the auteur who's like bringing this great grand vision to people on a silver platter at the 11th hour. It's sort of like it's a really bad sort of like mentality to have. You really have to kind of consider your whole team.
Yeah. I kind of I like when we talk about producers, I always think of action points. Like you have, because we go through the process of where you like task up stuff and you're like, oh, you have this many days to do this thing. And so I think of these tasks as like you have action points for what you want to do in the game. And then you just like, you can't move that. So then you would try to like figure out where you can best use those action points and where you can like polish stuff up, but you only have that many. And then it's kind of like less is more. The more you can cut it down and like see what is the most important and where your priorities lie, the cleaner your game ends up. You get a really clear vision of where to kind of put your calories, and then your game doesn't end up as bloated as it would have been if you just had your way with everything.
Absolutely. I think that's like when we talk about scoping and production and all that stuff, one of the best crash course you can give yourself and that sort of thing is game jams, right? I know you've given talks on game jams and advocated for things, but it's like nothing will get you to the heart of what you're trying to make faster than saying you have 2 days or you have 72 hours or you have a week or you have 24 hours or whatever it is. It's sort of like everything else, like you just kind of have to laser focus on that little moment or that little scenario or that little system or whatever it is you're trying to get at, and everything else kind of burns off in the atmosphere. Um, either either in a planned or unplanned way. But if you want to end up with something, you kind of have to like let that little atomic piece of game you're trying to point at, like, you have to be very protective of that. And part of protecting that is letting all the other bullshit kind of like burn off. And so that's a real thing.
Yeah. I think it's a good exercise too. Even if you are going to have all this extra stuff, it's nice to like cut it down, get laser focused on those bits, and then kind of expand it out and be like, oh, so what can I add on to that really clear focus? And then you end up with all the detail that you wanted, but in a clearer, cleaner way.
Yeah. Yeah. It's always like, it's always nice to get to the point where you can start adding things back in, but sometimes it, it just feels unattainable when there's too much stuff in there. You kind of have to get to the heart of it and then be like, okay, now we really need to think about this other stuff. And a lot of times that's like content where it's just like, now we have the system, now we need to kind of flesh this out. But yeah, that whole process, fitting the pieces together, can be really painful.
Yeah. I have another question that's more on the publishing side of design.
Yeah.
Have you seen anything that teams have done to help in the process with working with publishers? Or like, I know, like, hitting milestones is like a good thing. Having like good communication, being clear about their intentions, that sort of thing. But like, is there anything else that you've seen that works really well?
I think in general, it's all about communication. I think that's probably the case with any sort of like entity you're working with, when you're trying to do something creative. Um, but yeah, I think it really depends on who the publisher is. The good publishers are on your team and are going to do the best they can to support you and get you everything you need to kind of like finish your game. But if you find yourself in the business of having to like hide things from them or like not be like, it's going to come out eventually that you're behind schedule, and everything ultimately falls behind schedule in game development. It's hard to keep up. There's unexpected stuff that goes down. Um, so yeah, communication is a huge one, in terms of just like letting people know where you're at. I think we do a pretty good job of keeping up with people and being flexible and saying like, it's fine. We'll work it out if things are behind schedule or if things didn't click yet, or if there's a shift in priorities, or if there's whatever it is. You really just need to be able to have that conversation about it. Yeah, I'm trying to think about other guidance of like working with publishers. I think it's yeah, that's the main one, I
Yeah,
suppose.
it sounds similar to, I mean, it sounds transferable to just working in development teams in general. Like having transparency is super important. I've seen teams where there isn't transparency or communication and they kind of fall apart. People are like burnt out or they get a little depressed because they don't know what's going on and it doesn't feel like we're a team and that sort of thing. But when I've seen more transparency and accountability, not just transparency, but like, oh, look, things have fallen behind. This is how we're going to fix it. This is what we're going to try. And like, it's always worked out. So I think it seems to be very similar in that way.
Yeah.
So you've had many roles throughout your career. How has your approach to game design evolved through your different roles? And like, what is the difference between designer Jeff, lead Jeff, and director Jeff?
Whoa. That's tricky. it's hard to have that sort of like that self-reflection, I suppose, of how things have changed. I definitely feel like there was like earlier in my career, there was definitely this sort of like desire to prove myself that I could do it, that I could like um, build a level or balance an economy or like do these sort of like designer tricks to like um, make the game better or support the team or whatever it was. Nowadays, it's more, um, I find myself in a lot more how can I help roles. Like, what kind of feedback do you want or do you need, or are there things that you need to hear? I try to give at like, so there's a bit of a difference between like when it's me building something, I feel like I'm very um, strict in how I approach the thing and how I approach the problem. I try a couple things and then I'm like, okay, time to build. Um, writing, I do a lot of writing and I do a lot of talking and collaborating to kind of like get my head around the idea initially. And I try to give myself a lot of space for that. But I find that, and I think this is why I like doing UI stuff so much. And this might be like a hangover from working on mobile games as well. But like when you're actually kind of like trying to figure out what a screen is going to look like or what information is going to be available to people, you're kind of walking the line and you're kind of walking through what they're going to see and what they're going to do. And so it's easier to sort of like fully experience the problem space or fully experience it. So I tend to get really kind of like tunnel vision in like, okay, let's start putting the pieces together and figure out what's going to work and what's not going to work. And I just go into like kind of a flow state as a designer. As a lead designer, when I'm trying to direct designers to work on things, I do try to. I talk a lot about time boxes, and I'm like, okay, you can here's where we're trying to get to. You have I try to give as much kind of like room on the road for them to explore and take things in their own direction, but I'm like, here are the important things that this piece of content, this system, this level, this piece of writing, like whatever it is, here are the important things and what it needs to do. But I'm keen for you to walk the line. You're the one who has to do this work, so I want you to do the thing you're excited about. So I do try to leave as much room as possible for exploration and discovery. That can be a really hard thing to advocate for when it's like we got a deadline, we have a milestone, we have a build to cut, we have a release to get out the door, like whatever it is. But I think when you're in that kind of like pre-production, early production stage, it's sort of when you're still figuring out how you're going to build things, you don't want to. I find it's actually detrimental to try and kind of like railroad people into like your very specific vision of like what a thing needs to be. Um, and I think that kind of like feeds into like how I try to approach doing um, game direction or design direction or creative direction, I suppose. I'm like with like artists and that sort of thing is sort of like making sure that we're all pointed towards the same goals and that those goals are reiterated as much as possible, where it's like here's the overall vision for this piece of the game or this game kind of like top to bottom, and trying to continue to provide that north star or that kind of like top down view of the project. Because the more you because like I just described, the way I work as a designer, I go straight in. I'm like, what is the problem? Okay, I'm going to build this little area, I'm going to build this little marketplace, or I'm going to build this little castle or whatever it is, and you're just there building the castle. So it's nice to have someone who's kind of like that you can trust, who believes in what you're doing, who's sort of like, remember that this castle is one of 100 castles, and this is where the player is in the game in their experience. And so I do try to continue to stay as high level as I can, unless I really see someone struggling to kind of like land something. And then I go kind of a step back down into kind of like a lead role where I'm like, okay, so here are the important things. Here's what I would do. And I guess this is universally a thing. Like, I always try to frame things as like, especially when it comes into like problem solving. and kind of like, okay, how do we get the player to understand this, or how do we get the player to engage with this in a meaningful way, or whatever it is. It's sort of like saying, here's what I would do, so take it or leave it. Like, this is the idea to beat, basically. It's not, a lot of times it's not elegant or like clever. It's like, here's like the blunt sledgehammer way we could fix this. Now, if you have ideas that fix it in, the in a better way, or a way that you think will lead to a better player experience, that's great. But always having a fallback position. The only time it's scary is when you're like, I don't know what our fallback position is for that. And so, yeah, I guess that, I hope that answers it. Like the distinction between those different kind of like roles.
Yeah, I'm so curious about directing. It seems so difficult because, I mean, I know as a designer, I really like getting examples, like what you mentioned. The examples kind of help me understand what we're looking for in a more detailed way, in a form of a way that we could implement, which is really helpful to me. But I know that a lot of designers have different ways of communicating and taking in information. And I think it's really difficult because you never know until you talk to the designers and then you see how they react. It's like,
yeah,
some designers will be like, okay, I'll do that exact thing. And it's like, no, no, no. Like, it's just an example. Like, this works because of A, B, and C. And they're like, whoa, I don't understand. So it kind of seems like being a director, like being part of a director, is just having constant communication with your team, and not like in a controlling way, but just to be there when they need guidance, I guess.
yeah. I mean, that's a lot of it. Like, people, the amazing thing about working on video games is that it's this big collaborative thing, and you have people kind of like across all experience levels and across a bunch of different disciplines. And then even like lately, it's like even across different cultures and different, like, a lot of the people I work with are in a lot of different countries and have a lot of different ways of expressing their feelings about a thing, or articulating their idea in a way that like people can understand. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff in the sauce there where it's like, it does all kind of come back to communication and like how you get to the heart of the thing that you're trying to talk about, because it's also abstract and crazy and like esoteric in a lot of ways. That, like, I think you said something about examples in there where it's just like leaning on examples and saying like, let's start from what Disco Elysium did, or let's start from what like Limbo and Inside did, and like we'll find our own way. But like having that jumping off point is like something that I find a lot of indie developers are really allergic to. They think they're going to like kind of dive in and break new ground and come up with this whole new paradigm of, and unless you're like Lucas Pope or like Daniel Mullins or whatever, like these people are way out there. But even then, they kind of built that, like, they've kind of built their game design vocabulary over time by degrees as well. Like Inscription and Oberdin didn't just come out of nowhere. So anyway, yeah, leaning on example is one of those things where it's like I always advocate for, like, especially like when you start programming, when you start learning to program, they're like, make a calculator, like make Pong, or like make Breakout. Yeah, make Tetris, make Flappy Bird, like whatever it is. It's like you can build that thing and be like, okay, it's kind of like that, but not really. Like, it's kind of like that inventory system, but I want this little thing to be different. And I think um, that's where a lot of really, really cool stuff can happen.
It's just so weird how we define innovation, because everything came from somewhere. And I think, I mean, I'm all for innovative, original, like crazy games. I mean, the crazier they are, the more I like them, I think. But I think we take for granted, like, taking something that's been done and really polishing it to like a really great experience. I think that has a lot of value, and I think it's kind of undervalued. I think we've been chasing like the hot new thing, and like something that is completely revolutionizing games, and I'm like, I don't need that. Just give me a good experience and do it well, and I'll love it. So I think it's funny how we hold that up high, um, in a
Yeah.
weird definition of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, absolutely. Yeah.
So you've worked on an indie game yourself, uh, well, multiple indie games. um, but I know that you've worked on designing narrative for the indie game Sailforth. Uh, is there anything that, looking back, you would have done differently? And do you have any
Oh man.
advice for people who want to write for indie games?
Oh my. Oh man. That's so for context, Sailforth, working on Sailforth and being asked to write for Sailforth. I had done a little bit, like on some of the mobile games I'd worked on, I'd done a little bit of the dialogue writing and little bits, and I've always loved that thing. But being asked to actually kind of take on that whole that undertaking with Sailforth was like this huge moment for me because um, it was just kind of like this. David, the developer, had this whole kind of like game already sorted out that he'd been working on for years, and we've been friends for years. So I'd kind of seen it go from this very modest sort of proposal to this big, you know, dynamically generated open world sailing game, the very kind of cartoony open world kind of adventure timey sailing game, and it just had he came to me and was like, well, I want like there to be characters and bosses and like the shops and stuff all need some flavor. And I really took that and ran with it. And like, so there's a lot I would do differently. We sort of found our way how we were going to build that stuff and how we were going to get that writing into the game. And a lot of the like crazier things I pitched to David, uh, he never really told me no. I was like, but there should be these frogs, this faction of like frog people that like are, you know, in these submarines, and they show up and they help you and they ask you riddles and that sort of thing. And shopkeepers should be these little like slug alien things in these big mechanical suits. And David was like, right on, like all this stuff. So all that outside the box stuff was really cool to write. I think the thing I learned, because we were always kind of walking the line between bespoke encounters with enemies and things and more dynamically generated stuff. And some of it feels like there was room for there to be kind of like a halfway house. I feel like the game's design in general kind of like walks the line between these hand authored set pieces with like the bosses and such, and all of the kind of like soup, all of the dynamically generated, like there's some bad guys over here and some treasure over here and whatever. So I feel like the writing was kind of like in a similar state of flux throughout most of the project, where it was like I would write some things, it would take a little bit, it would make it into the game, and we'd kind of look at it and say like that's roughly what we were after. And some of the dynamically generated stuff feels too dynamically generated, and some of the hand authored stuff just felt too kind of like one and done. Like we put a bunch of effort into it, but then like the odds of people even seeing it was pretty low, and then it was kind of like that was it, it was kind of outside the box. So I feel like I still feel like to this day there was like this kind of middle road that we were always kind of like drunk driving all over, and we kind of like never really landed on the runway there. Um, but man, when I play it, I just have a smile on my face the whole time. It's such a cool, chill, funny, strange little game. And it being the first thing I'd actually contributed so much writing to. I asked David recently how many words or like how many pages, or and it was just like this huge number that we kind of cranked out. And it's what's most remarkable, I guess, about Sailforth too is that it was all David. Like solo developed this gigantic like Zelda scale, Breath of the Wild, you know, scope and scale is just him doing everything. So I was happy to just like dip in for a very small amount of time comparatively and say like, okay, so frogs, mermaid people, a Hydra, like these machines, and just kind of like dabble a little bit and add a little bit of color and a little bit of like life to the world. And yeah, just it's one of my favorite things I've ever worked on, and I still kind of like hold it close today.
I think your writing really worked with this game. Knowing David, I think it kind of matches who he is.
Yeah.
I don't know. I hope he doesn't take offense to that, but
I
I
would
think.
hope not.
Well, I mean, I don't mean any offense to you either, but I think it really matches him. So I think it was really, and I like having the stuff that people may not come across, because then you can like share it with each other, like shareability. It's a good
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah, that's right. It was funny too. Yeah, that whole process was just really fun, especially when it came time to localize it, because my writing was pretty like chaotic and all over the place in terms of dialects, and some of the factions in the game had like made up like insane ways of speaking, and some people really didn't like it either. So I was we actually had like the base writing, which was all the stuff I did, and then I think at one point they added like simplified English to like it was one of the text options you could choose, so that like you could actually understand what everyone was saying.
I
And
think
then they
that's great.
actually, yeah, and I think one of the producers on the project also did some of the writing and like took all of my chaos and distilled it down to like what it meant, so they could localize it. So I think the all of the other languages are based on like a normalized version to the extent that you can do that.
It's
Pretty
great
wild.
that there's a simplified version. I kind of feel like that when I watch a movie that I can't understand the accents for. I'm like, wait,
Yeah,
help me, just help
totally.
me. But
Yeah, I was just watching a video about that with anyway, to go off on a tangent uh, with Robert Eggers stuff, right? Where he did The Witch and Northman and what was the other one? Oh, The Lighthouse, where they have all these crazy dialects that you really have to like. You're like, what are they? Wait, what? And like, I don't know. So The Lighthouse is an interesting reference too, because we have the Lighthouse Keepers in Sailforth as well. They're probably the most understandable faction in the game, but I did take a lot of inspiration from the Lighthouse for the Angler Wrangler faction, like the Fisherman faction, because they have a bunch of stuff in the sauce in
you
terms of
make a
like.
lot of references though. There's watching that streamer that was like, is that a Little Mermaid reference? I was like,
Oh
yeah,
yeah.
that's awesome.
Yeah, that's one of the great joys too. And I didn't know how many David actually picked up on too. Because when it's funny, the Little Mermaid is the one you call out, because when I wrote that stuff in there, because the Lighthouse Keeper faction has like a Little Mermaid style mechanic where you bring them treasures from like our world, so like records and garden gnomes and spatulas and things. And the people who live in Sailforth don't know what that stuff is anymore. So the Light Keepers like make up a version of like what they think those things might do, sort of like the seagull in Little Mermaid does. And I was like, yeah, this mechanic is like Scuttle in the Little Mermaid. And David hadn't seen the Little Mermaid, had no idea what I was talking about. So
I have
it's
to
fun because I get to pretend I invented those things.
I have to find David and force him to watch The Little Mermaid. I don't know if he'll be okay with it. I think he'd be like, okay, that's cool. Like if I
Yeah,
really think
yeah.
about it. But yeah, I like to think that people played the game with all the crazy dialect and then turned it off and then missed it. I feel that way with like spicy foods. If you eat, I used to like eat spicy noodles. I'm like, it's too spicy. And then I would eat it without like, there's Korean like cold noodles and you can put this like mustard in it. It's like this hot type of mustard. And I'm like, oh, that's disgusting. It's too hot. And then I started eating it without. And then I was like, oh, it's too bland now. And so now I'm like, do I like the hot mustard in my noodles? I think I do. So I hope that they get that feeling of like, do I like this weird dialect? Maybe I do.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was one of those things. I don't know how much people actually complained about it, but it was fun to when the game was like getting ready to be launched, watching streamers and people actually play it on their streams and like read the text out. It was really satisfying.
My favorite is watching people. I talked to David about this, but watching people play with the what do you call it? The fleet AI?
Yeah.
Because your fleet will like run into you and you're like, what are you doing? And I just love it because it's like you just have a bunch of clumsy ship crew, and it's so endearing, I think, but probably frustrating, but I think it's really fun to watch. So maybe not the most ideal AI, but shareability. Again, very good for shareability. Yeah, stream that stuff.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's one of the great joys, I think, of maybe it's like one of the great terrors as well of being a designer is watching people play your stuff where you're like, oh God, please do the thing. Please understand the concept, or please enjoy the thing. So yeah, play testing and watching streamers play. I think when you start to watch streamers play it and you can't touch it and you can't talk to them and you can't be like, oh yeah, go over there, push the red button or like whatever. Like that's when the game starts to feel really real. Because for a long time in development, anyone who's built a game will tell you that like it feels very ephemeral, or it feels very like unreal, I guess. And then as it gets closer to launch, it starts to feel more real. And when you do like your reveal or a little trailer or your Steam page goes live or whatever, it starts to feel more tangible. And so yeah, watching streamers play is like watching them enjoy this thing you've been kind of like building in the dark for so long is like this really amazing thing.
Do you feel at peace? Because I imagine it's like you're a ghost and you're watching like your loved ones making all these mistakes and you're like, no, don't do that. But like at some point, like after years of being a ghost, you're like, okay, you're gonna be fine.
Yeah, I did the best I could. Yeah.
And then you move on and you ascend.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so more challenging questions. I have another one. It actually has the phrase challenging in it, so I hope you're ready for this.
So ready.
What was the most challenging experience that you've had in your time in the industry?
Yeah. That is one of those classic questions. What is the most challenging?
I got a lot of classic questions.
I will say the thing that immediately struck me, I don't know if it's the most challenging, but definitely a big challenge, was like staying inspired at bigger companies. Like when you're sort of like when you have less autonomy or less agency as a creative person. Yeah, when you're part of the machine, it can be really difficult to like stay motivated when you just feel like you're holding a chair down, or you're just like your amount of input on a project is limited, especially early in my career, I suppose, where you're just sort of like, but I want to do this other stuff. And sometimes the steer from your directors and leads is like, it doesn't need that. We're not doing that. It's out of scope, or it's not in line with the project. And I feel like that's part of being a junior, is sort of like figuring out, well, what is that ambition? What is my role? How does my little slice of contribution make this thing better, or make it go, or make it appealing to players, or whatever it is. But when you're in a big apparatus like that, some of that is also like, well, how can I be creative? How can I contribute to this thing's success? And when it comes back to like what I was saying about the way I try to offer leadership or direction to people, is sort of like when the road is so narrow, you really feel like railroaded into like, I'm just a factory worker who is taking this thing, and I have to ask the lead, like, okay, what do you want? What do you want this to be? How do you want this to work? What should this look like? And I will go and do it. Like taking an order into the kitchen and making the food and bringing it back out. And that's not why we do this. That's not why designers are want to work on games. We're not like these robotic factory workers. And so I think that's informed how I do things. But it's also like when I think back across my career, those parts where I felt very kind of like creatively kneecapped or like just unfulfilled by the work. Those were instances where it was just like, just do the thing, just do the thing we always do, and do it again and make it, 2% better or not even that. And so, I think that's the most challenging. That's probably not the kind of answer you were going for, but I think
No.
like, as far as like the structure of game development teams, those can be really, when there are so many chefs in the kitchen and you're just responsible for like the carrots, like they're like, just peel the carrots, do the carrots exactly that way. You're kind of like, okay, I want that next degree of, input.
Yeah, no, I think that's a huge challenge. I'm so curious as to like how you handled that. For me, it's sort of like I found areas elsewhere, or it was more communication. Like I learned that in some cases, it's not that like I couldn't have input or do what I think would give value. It's just that I needed to make my case in a way that made sense. In some cases, it wasn't that. I was just a cog in the machine. But
Yeah.
in some cases, it was sort of like, well, no, I have to push for what I believe in because no one knows how important it is. And if I cannot explain why it is, then there's no way for them to know. So I'm curious about the ways that you handled it or things that you found to deal with it.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of cases, it almost always just spilled out into like spinning up some solo project I was working on in my spare time, or um, just letting it be what it is, like letting that process kind of like happen, and then being like, well, I'm going to work on this other stuff in my free time. Um, a lot of the problem with that, though, is that like that, and I think that's actually the kind of like core problem of what makes it like the hardest thing in the industry is like that sort of work, that sort of role, where you're in those positions can really be draining. And so doing that for 8, 10, 12 hours a day, whatever it is, and then being like, oh, now I'm going to spin up this fun thing, um, can be really, it's really challenging to do anything. And I felt that way early in my career too. I guess a lot of my philosophy of like working on games and why I sort of like have a hard time saying no to like when people want to work with me is because like I'm just so grateful to have the opportunity to work on things now, because a lot of it back early in my career, and when I was in school to do this, I was just like so eager to do anything that wasn't like my normal jobs, like running a forklift or making food or delivering pizza or waiting tables or whatever. It's just like doing that and then having these little game projects on the side or these little creative projects on the side, finding that fire in your belly to work on those things when you've been doing like your job all day is like a really challenging thing. And so I think that continued when you kind of like ride the waves of your career and you're kind of at a low point where you're like, I worked this hard to get to this point where I just don't feel it. And so having those sorts of like people working on things, having people like David be like, hey, come do some writing for this thing, is like that, because that was sort of like a side project at the time too, and I was so grateful to have that. Um,
Yeah,
so.
It's funny because I see some people who are affected by these sorts of things, and it kind of just like after a long period of time of having to deal with this, it kind of like pushes them to make a decision of like, I'm gonna go indie, or like for me, I'm more like I'm gonna adapt, and it like I'll be in situations where I'm like, why would you like have this design this way? I don't understand. I'd just be frustrated, but like keep trying to make it work, and
Yeah.
then learn how to make something work with something that isn't ideal. And I think it's leveled up some of my skills, but like it's also great. I mean, it's kind of sad that it's like being not being content that like pushes them into like going indie or doing their own projects. But I think it kind of like builds up passion. It has like
Totally.
kind of the passion pulls up and you're like, okay, never mind, I'm just gonna do it. And so at the very least, in some cases, I see a lot of good from it. Not giving it any excuses for like I'm not like that's not like a good thing, but at least I've seen some good from coming from it. And so good on people.
Yeah, I think it is though. I think it is good ultimately. Like the value of that sort of like discontentment, and even pushing people out to do indie stuff or to build their own studio or to have those side projects or to do game jams or like whatever it is. Like game jams have been like the real lifeblood of of my whole career. Really, like being able to stop and do those from time to time really like reinvigorates like my that initial piece of excitement that like when I was playing video games as a kid kind of like lit up my whole brain. I was like like being able to kind of like drop in and do something crazy for like just a little while and put something together. Like I found I could go back to those less inspiring jobs and be like, okay, let's push a little harder, let's make it a little better, let's get a little weirder with it. And like come at it with kind of renewed enthusiasm for the work, for the craft. And so that's what's really fun about those side projects and all that stuff. But I think even like what I was talking about with taking care of people, offering direction, being a lead, blah blah blah, it's like a lot of times those positions are you're better prepared to be in those roles when you've had it in bad shape. Does that make sense? Like if you've had a bad time, if you've had a bad manager or a bad job spec or whatever it is, it's like then being asked to do those things, you're like, okay, well now I kind of know what bad looks like, rather than just like saying, oh, no matter what I do, it'll be fine. Kind of like know some of the things to avoid or ways to make your team's life a little bit better, a little bit easier.
Yeah, I really appreciate the bad experiences I've had. It's weird because I've learned the most from them. And it's probably not a good habit to get addicted to these things, like searching for bad bad situations to be
Yeah.
in. But like
Yeah.
I think I definitely find myself in that situation, like where I'm like, oh, that's interesting. That looks problematic. Let's get into it.
Yeah.
Um,
I don't know if it's like seeking out bad situations necessarily, but I think we kind of like game designers are fixers and problem solvers. So we do like to get into situations where we're maybe out of our depth or we're a little less comfortable.
I
Or
think,
we're looking at games or genres that we haven't looked at before.
yeah.
And so, yeah, I think there is some degree of like, let's do the, let's do the thing that maybe isn't the most obvious.
I think you and I also like living life in hard mode. Like, oh, we can do it in that amount of time. What about less time? What
That's
about with
right.
less resources? Can we do that? What about if this thing is broken? Like,
Yeah,
I think we thrive off of it. But it's fun. So,
absolutely.
um, okay. So I have another challenging question for you. Maybe it's not that challenging. I think it's fun. But what values would be most important for you if you were to start an indie studio?
What values would be?
Yeah.
I think a lot of the same kinds of things that I'm talking about. I think actually, communication's obviously a big one. keeping people inspired, not railroading people into doing exactly the thing I want them to do. I feel like a lot of the best indie studios have this sort of like, there's a whole team behind the vision of a thing, no matter how crazy it is. Like you get something like Bug Snacks, or you get something like Arctic Eggs, or you get something like Untitled Goose Game, or like you just feel that team, or Thank Goodness You're Here. It's like you just know that team just like understood what they were doing, and that they were all kind of bought in on it. Whether it was like it started as someone's idea, it sort of became the whole studio's idea. And I think those are the best. Those are the best kinds of things. So yeah, I would want to sort of like find the studio identity with a group of people and work with people who want to be there and who believe in the thing, and just try to take care of each other and make the thing, like keep it human. That's a really nice one that's been going around lately. It's like, yeah, games are hard to make. They're a lot harder if you're trying to do it, um, you know, in a negative way. Or you're trying to like impose your will on people, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah. I do think, like, for me, it's like I want my team to be happy. I know there's like a balance between making a product and having your teammates be happy, but it feels like, I don't know, I've been very fortunate in my career where it's like I could just get a job at any point in time. Like a job like isn't hard I mean, it is hard in like in this at this time, but like I can eventually get a job, but like if I'm going to do this thing with people that I like, I want them to be happy, right? And I want to create something that's meaningful to us. So I feel like you feel very similarly.
Yeah, yeah, and I feel like you kind of have to start from that initial enthusiasm, that initial like, let's do our own thing, let's go make our own mistakes for once.
Yeah. Um, and then final question. I've had this trip up people before, but
Oh wow,
what
I'm ready.
advice? I think you won't have a problem with it, but what advice do you have for past Jeff?
Uh, yeah, that is a good one. Heard you ask that one on here before. What would my answer be? What should my answer be? I suppose like the main thing, because I had so much anxiety about like making it and like being able to do this for a living, and to not only kind of like make ends meet, but to like have some kind of advancement and to kind of get sort of where I've ended up. But I think the main thing I would want to communicate to myself is just like relax. It's gonna be okay. Like um, you can work on things with your friends. You can do game jams. You can find jobs in between things. Jobs are sometimes hard to come by, especially early in your career. Finding that second gig, that third gig, and having a resume that actually looks like you've worked on something that anyone has heard of. Um, that would be my main thing, is just relax a little bit. And then the other big one, I suppose, that I've definitely come to value more than anything is the people that you're working with are the actual value of any project. I think in earlier in my career, I was really focused on what can I say I've worked on and to what degree, like these pieces of content for this game, or these levels, or this mechanic. I worked on that specific thing in that game, and I wanted to point at these things, sometimes to the detriment of forming meaningful relationships with people I was developing the games with. Over the course of my career, what I've often found is like studios and projects and platforms in some ways are like so temporary. The through line in my entire career has been the people who you work with, who you have these bonds with and these commonalities and these sort of like this camaraderie of like I really like the way you work on this stuff. I really like the way you think about this stuff and articulate these things. So to, again, chill out a little bit and spend some time forming connections with people, because when this studio blows up, when this project goes under or doesn't ship, or whatever other misfortune kind of befalls people in the game industry, it's like all of those people are going to be out in the industry and they're going to know you and they're going to remember you. So I find that the most success I've had and the most satisfying kind of like experiences I've had in the industry are working with those people and watching them grow and evolve, and sort of like, so I've come to really value the people that I surround myself with more than the product.
Yeah, it's so funny to hear you say that, because like I know like you've grown throughout your career, but since I've known you, it feels like you care quite deeply about people. So it's been very apparent to me that that's what you value. So um, it's
That's
really
nice to
nice.
hear.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I think, I mean, Game Dev Local, you've heard it here. People are what matter. I think that's a wrap. That's a nice thing to end on. I hope you had a good time during this interview, Jeff, and I really appreciate you joining me on this episode. And I hope
I
everyone
did.
enjoyed it as well.
This was amazing. Thank you, Nina.
Thank you. And thank you for tuning in, everyone. See you next time.